Well, here we are on Facebook Live, and it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome Dr. Jordan Peterson, a friend of mine, professor of psychology at University of Toronto, as well as a clinical psychologist and cultural critic. He's risen to media prominence battling anti-free speech laws in Canada and using his YouTube channel to critique political correctness in Western society, plus his biblical lectures are wildly popular. He has a brand new book out, 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. It is topping all of the bestseller charts right now, and it answers the question, what does everyone in the modern world need to know? So pretty big question that you seek to answer there, Jordan. So let's jump right in. So number one, how do you feel? You've been the man of the moment, and there's no question that right now your star has risen. What do you attribute that to? Why do you think it is that you went from somebody who's sort of the right wing new even mid last year to somebody who's now getting profiled in all of the biggest newspapers on planet Earth?
It's hard to put my finger on that exactly. I think some of it is a consequence of the effect of YouTube. I've been putting my lectures on YouTube for a long time, and then when the political situation that I got embroiled in hit, people came because of the political content, but they stayed because of the, I would say, academic content. And then that laid the groundwork for this book. And then, of course, I've been fortunate in the oddest way with my choice of interviews. So the Channel 4 interview with Kathy Newman, of course, has gone completely viral. And then I've made a lot of associations, with people like you and other people on YouTube, and that's really, there's a lot of power on the alternative media, so to speak, now. There's a lot of power in that. So it's the culmination of many things. But I'm also talking about things, I would say, of fundamental importance and things that our society is in danger of forgetting or losing. And that's a bad thing. And for people to be reminded of what that content is, I think is extraordinarily good for them.
One of the things that I've found that's so interesting is that there's a whole group of people, we talked about this on Dave Rubin's show, on the Rubin Report, there's a whole group of people who have become wildly popular on YouTube, and they have popular shows and podcasts and books. And it's all because I think we sort of share the Herman Melville Bartleby quality, which is that we're just kind of sitting around saying no to things. And in today's society, that seems like a real act of rebellion, simply to say no to the prevailing current, even if we all disagree with each other on various matters, large and small. You obviously came to prominence originally for one of the reasons that I've gotten a lot of flack in the United States, and that's because you refused to use transgender pronouns. You refused to allow people to pick their own pronouns, and obviously that was a subject in the Kathy Newman interview.
I refused to do it because it was made into a mandatory requirement by law. And so that was, for me, that was an unacceptable intrusion of the political ideologues into the private philosophical and even theological spheres. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not willing to let anyone dictate the content of my speech. And I have all sorts of reasons for that, many of which are detailed in the book. It's absolutely unacceptable to me. And so, I did say no. In a video I made that has become quite infamous, I suppose, critiquing Bill C-16, and it's been confused with a statement that makes me transphobic and bigoted and all of that. But it was much more fundamental than any of that, which is that the government does not get to legislate what I say, period. I don't care what it's about. And I really seriously mean that. And I think that people knew that when I made the video. And so I took that abstract issue and made it very concrete. I said I wasn't going to comply with this ideological catastrophe, and I wasn't going to cede the linguistic territory to the radical postmodern neo-Marxists.
And I think it's that last phrase, that postmodern Marxist phrase, that's one that you tend to use a lot. And if you don't mind, I'd like you to kind of dig down into that for folks who are not super familiar with your material. When you talk about your critique of postmodernism and Marxism and the postmodern Marxist movement, the kind of combination, what do you mean by postmodern?
Well, I think people are I think how people know this better in the sort of day-to-day realm is as identity politics. So it's this idea that, first of all, that you're defined by your group, which you are most certainly not in my estimation. And second, that the universe of mankind is a battleground of warring groups all vying for power, and there is nothing else to vie for, by the way, according to that doctrine, and that that's the proper way to view the world, and that you can add an oppressor-oppressed narrative on top of that, and that orients you properly in the world. And not only do I not agree with any of that, I think it's dangerous almost beyond belief. I think we played identity politics throughout the 20th century, both on the right and the left, and that the consequences of that was unutterably catastrophic. And so that's postmodernism. Postmodernism is the doctrine that there are no grand narratives left, and that that there's an infinite number of ways to interpret the world, and that there's no way of ranking those ways on a value scale, let's say. And I believe that to be not only wrong philosophically, but wrong factually and religiously. It's wrong in every way that something can be wrong, which is quite interesting. And I think it's passé, actually.
This is one of the things that I think is fascinating, because I've debated Sam Harris. You're going to do a couple of events with Sam up in Canada, and you obviously have fundamental disagreements with Sam. You had a 3-hour conversation about the nature of truth. I have fundamental disagreements with Sam about the nature of where truth comes from. But I think where we all agree, whether or not we're all willing to admit it, is the idea that the postmodern critique of truth itself is a failure. That the idea that truth exists somewhere out there and that it's up to us to discover it. We all come from a different perspective, I think, as to how do we get to that truth. But the idea that the truth exists and that it's something worth pursuing is something that we all hold in common in this sort of weird moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is that there's a belief that truth is not merely arbitrary, which is a really fundamental postmodern claim, which I think it's wrong. There's a new book out by a psychologist named Tomasello, and I haven't seen it yet, but I know something about it. I mean, he's documenting the accruing, say, biological evidence for the emergence of complex ethics, even before the what would you say, in biological systems, even prior to the emergence of humanity. Not only is there ethical truth, but it probably supersedes our species. And I don't think there's any debate among that anymore among serious biologists. And then I believe that there's a literary and metaphorical and metaphysical overlay on top of that, and I don't exactly understand the relationship between all those different, what would you call them, levels of analysis, but I'm trying to do that, and that's what I'm trying to figure out in my lectures as well. So I think we all believe that there's something about truth that's not arbitrary, and I also think we all believe that one of the ways that you approach that truth is through genuine dialogue, and that's not dialogue where, well, I'm actually listening to you because there's always the chance that you might know something that I don't, which is rule 11 in my book, by the way. Assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't.
Yeah, well, I think that's a huge point for I think all of us who are in this particular area is the willingness to say, and I think that the more you're willing to say this, the better off you're going to be in life. I don't know. Like knowing where your area of expertise ends, knowing where somebody else's area of expertise may begin, and knowing that you may not know everything, I think is the prerequisite to a happy life. And that's what's also fascinating is that, Jordan, if people watch your stuff on YouTube, you're not somebody who comes off as wildly optimistic. When people watch my stuff, I'm not somebody who comes off as wildly optimistic. But what I tend to get when I go out in public, and I know you've discussed this before, you discussed this on Dave's show as well, is you get a lot of people coming up to you and saying that you give them hope, that you have helped guide them in their life, that you've helped them make their life better. And how do you reconcile the fact that we can both be so pessimistic about human nature, that we're not full-on Marxist utopians who believe that humanity is completely malleable, with the idea that there's so many people who feel more optimistic after having listened to the message that you're promulgating in your book, 12 Rules for Life?
Yeah, I know. It's really something because, well, I even see this at the public talk. So I talked here in Toronto this week, and I said, I basically told people that the most undeniable truth, the most undeniable and self-evident truth is that life is tragedy and suffering tainted by malevolence, which is about as harsh a message as you can possibly give. But everyone knows that, eh? And so it's a relief to people that someone just comes out and says that. But then I ally that with a message that I think is in concordance with religious messages, for example, but also with psychological messages, that despite the fact that that is the landscape through which we wander, so a tragic landscape that's tainted by evil and malevolence, that there are ways of being that help us transcend that and stop us from participating in its brutality and orient us towards a noble end, and that those things are, because they're more powerful than tragedy and more powerful than malevolence, they're even more real. And I really believe that. Like, I truly believe that the sense of meaning is the fundamental instinct that grounds us in being. And I think the evidence for that is increasingly overwhelmingly clear. You can make a very solid scientific case for this. Even in my biblical lectures, like, I tried to stay out of the metaphysical, I tried to stay in the literary and psychological and biological for a variety of reasons. Not that I deny the existence of anything metaphysical. It's a different question. But I think the facts that we have at our disposal now, neurophysiologically, from animal comparative studies, Heideggerian philosophy, from Jungian psychoanalytic theory, all these sources point to a transcendent ethic. And I think it's an ethic that also produces highly functional social units, families, and also highly functional societies. And I think we nailed that in the West. So we got it right. We got our metaphysics right.
Right. So that's the next question that I want to ask you, because whenever you talk about the sort of biological component of ethics, which is also something that Harris talks about, why is it the West then got it right and other societies didn't? Meaning, if it's all biological and it can be reduced down to a biological function, then why exactly do societies differ in how they treat ethical questions?
Well, I think that there is commonality and difference. I mean, there is evidence, for example, that even in tyrannical cultures, like let's take communist China, for example, that stable families tend to have a relatively democratic internal structure. And so some of it is what people act out and some of it is what people say. And I would say what people act out worldwide in cultures that are functional is quite similar. What they say about how they act is different. And so you might think about it as a difference in the conscious mapping function. And I think what happened was that partly because of the biblical stories, but also, and the tremendous analysis that went into them, and the great Western philosophical and literary tradition, and the tradition of free and skeptical inquiry that we've done, and the development of institutions like English common law and democracy, is that we've been able to articulate this underlying ethic better. And not necessarily always to act it out. Obviously, the West has its problems, but I think we're in the forefront of the proper articulation of the transcendent mode of being. And I do think a lot of that is a consequence of the foundation of our civilization in the biblical stories, because they're actually unbelievably sophisticated. So. And they're unbelievably sophisticated ethically.
And that's what's so fascinating also. I think one of the things that's happened is that your biblical lectures, which are, very abstruse. I mean, these are not lectures for beginners. I mean, if you actually have to know the stories, you have to be able to listen closely, you have to be able to analyze and think along with you. I mean, they're not easy, for sure. I mean, your book Maps of Meaning is certainly not an easy book. And yet they have this huge following. I mean, the biblical lectures have a very big following, which raises
among all sorts of people, among atheists too, and among Muslims as well, from what I've been understanding.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's fascinating.
And I get letters from Orthodox Jews in Germany saying, they're really happy about the lectures, and I get letters from Orthodox priests and monasteries and like all religious people all over the world, regardless of denomination, saying, wow, we're really enjoying these biblical lectures. And I think, it's not so strange, but
well, I think one of the reasons for that, as an Orthodox Jew and having watched your lectures, I mean, I think that one of the things that I think a lot of religious people come to is that whether or not you believe in the truth or falsity of the literalist interpretation of these events in the Bible, which has been open to interpretation in the biblical tradition for a very long time, particularly the stories of Genesis, right? I mean, the fact is that if you look at the Jewish tradition with regard to Genesis, these are all stories that there have been serious questions as to where exactly the literal version of the Bible begins, because it certainly does not begin in sort of the Jewish tradition at Adam and Eve literally in a garden eating an apple. So that being the case, one of the things that people have resonated to is the fact that you talk about more of the utility and the necessity for stories like this in guiding human beings. And I think that's what religious people resonate to. And it's something that I've argued, right? I never argue from the Bible, but what I will say to people is you sort of have to acknowledge that the values that the Bible puts forward are the values that you are living on the back of, even if you disagree with the veracity of the Bible.
Right. Well, which points to something, at least in principle, about the biblical narrative that's true. It's just, and this is where I augured in with Sam, is that there's a kind of truth that we don't understand. Well, there's multiple kinds of truths that we don't understand, but we don't really understand how to deal with the fact that fiction tells the truth, because we can't figure out how something that's fictional, like a Dostoevsky novel, for example, can reveal great truths. And I kind of think of the Bible as it's like meta fiction. And in some ways, that makes it more true than reality. So interesting. There's a book called The Master and Margarita, which is a great book by a Russian named Bulgakov, and it details Satan's adventures in 1930s Soviet Union when he comes back to Earth, and because no one believes in him, he can do whatever he wants. But he details out the adventures of the apostles when they write down what happens in Christ's life. And they're they're inspired by God to write down the stories, but what they write down is not a factual account of what's actually happened in front of their eyes. They're writing a different kind of history of the events, and it's a mythologized history is one way of thinking about it. But this is something we don't understand well, and it's something I'm really looking forward to discussing with Sam, because I don't understand what he makes of the fact that fiction can tell the truth. What kind of truth is that? Like, he insisted that the only truth is scientific truth, which is clearly wrong. There's the truth of the heart, and there's the truth of the flight of an arrow, and the word true is used in all sorts of ways that is much more archaic than scientific truth. But there is truth in fiction, and the Bible is a kind of complex fiction, whatever else it might be. And it's a kind of complex fiction that reveals a truth that's more true than factual history. Because factual history also requires a narrative, right? You can't tell factual history without a story. And so history is also a strange discipline, because it's partly empirical, but also partly narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is all fascinating stuff, and I wish that we had more time, but we'll have to do this again very soon. I know you're coming back to LA, so we definitely will. Dr. Peterson's new book is 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. If you haven't seen it yet, it really is terrific. I've read it. I can recommend it highly. It's something everybody should read. And watching Dr. Peterson's work and watching his lectures, it is a way to make your life better. I mean, there are a lot of people who watch it and feel helped by it. There's a self-help component of it that I'm not even sure that, Jordan, you were anticipating when you first began doing what you're doing, but clearly
I am a clinical. Well, it's funny, Ben, because I am a clinical psychologist.
That's true.
My goal has been to bring effective psychological interventions to as large a population as possible. It's been a conscious goal since the early 1990s.
Well, you clearly do it here in the book, so you've clearly fulfilled that telos, so that's pretty exciting. So the book is 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. The guest, Dr. Jordan Peterson. Jordan, thanks so much for joining us. This is Facebook Live with Ben Shapiro.